The smaller of the two pups gave a raspy, wrong little howl when Helena shoved her mittened hand where the snow had opened like a mouth and pulled it free. The sound was a pistol crack in her chest, a sudden reminder that something could still begin even when everything she loved had already been buried. The animal was no bigger than a loaf of bread, its fur matted with ice, eyes milky with cold. Its sibling was tangled in the roots of a wind-fallen pine, a fist-sized knot of brown fur and breathless white. Helena's bathrobe dragged in the snow, her knees splitting the crust, the breath that had been steady in the kitchen now small and jagged in the storm. For a moment the world narrowed to two tiny chests trying to rise, and the stove light in her kitchen pulling at her like a private sun. She thought of nothing fancy, only warmth, only a bottle, only the old lullaby her mother had hummed in a language that had been forgotten by everyone living. She scooped the pups inside as if scooping secret prayers, and for the first time in years let herself hope that mercy could be as simple as a radiator and a blanket. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Helena's cottage smelled of boiled cabbage and pine resin, two honest smells that had kept her company since Antoni died. Her hands, knobby as old map keys, trembled as she set the pups by the cast-iron stove and watched the ice on their whiskers bead and melt. Outside, the pines leaned and leaned, then straightened, their trunks like fingers knitting against the wind. The old woman hummed without thinking, the ancient lullaby syllables coming back soft and stubborn, a language sewn into the bones. Mora, mora, stresh, as if her mother were standing in the doorway dipping a wet hand into the cup of the world and pressing it warm again. She fed them with a makeshift syringe and an old tin bowl. One pup's eyelid fluttered, the other lay like a sorrow that could be soothed only by heat. Helena wrapped them in a faded scarf, feeling foolish and ferocious in the same heartbeat. In that small, bright kitchen she was both a woman who had once had deeds and papers, and a woman who had learned to be small, to avoid making noise in a world that punished widows with silence. The pups made a small, absurd circle with their bodies, and Helena watched them breathe, and for the first time in 20 years she allowed herself to imagine a beginning that wasn't paperwork and regret. Her mind moved, as it always did, to the ledger of the past, her father at the big oak table, the ink blotting on land contracts, the gravelly voices of men who had promised the world and delivered a calendar of fires. The sale had been legal. The scars had been legal.
When the timber company took sections of the northern forest, they had taken more than trees. Strands of an older covenant had been cut without anyone noticing the tremor beneath the soil. That was the part her son never forgave. Adam had left the house with a slammed door and a suitcase. He had been 27 then, full of a righteous fire that still echoed in letters she kept folded inside cookbooks. A soft, almost shy knock at the door startled her so badly she spilled broth on the floor. Through the frosted glass, a boy, no, a man, not much younger than her son, stood with a ranger's cap in his hands. His cheeks were wind-whipped, his jacket patched where brambles had taught it humility. "Pani Kowalczyk?" he said, using the old, careful formal address. "I'm sorry. There's been reports. Strange tracks. People in the forest said they'd heard big footsteps." Tomasz appeared earnest enough to be dangerous. He carried a rifle slung low across his back and a packet of official-looking papers that blocked the sun when he raised them. He looked at the doorway and then at the stove, where two little noses were now curled by the iron. "Are those fox pups?" His tone held the littlest hope for a simple answer. Helena blinked. The word inside her wanted to be lie and truth both. They were not foxes. She could see how ridiculous that would sound. Could she say what she knew and invite the forest in with a single cramped admission? If she confessed she had thawed two Sasquatch pups, the men with the cap and the brochures and the name of the timber company would call scientists. Scientists would call fans and cameras, and here to take wonder and leave study. Yet to hide them was to open herself to accusations of madness, or to theft of something that wasn't hers to hold. "I don't know what they are," Helena admitted, which was the only honest answer she could give without giving everything away. "They were in the drift on the east side, by the old spring." Her voice came out thin like spun sugar. Tomasz's face shifted then, the way a wool landscape lowers its shoulders in wind. He crouched by the stove, keeping his distance with the habit of someone who had been taught to watch but not to touch. "They're warm," he said. "You found them in time." He glanced at her hands, at the way her fingers stained with berry dye from Friday's jam. "Will you call someone? Wildlife? There have been rumors." Helena shook her head because she had already made a decision in the gloom between saving something and watching it die. "Not yet," she said. Whatever they are, they would have died. Outside, as if the word had been a bell, the forest held its breath and then let out a sound that was not a voice and not a wind, a pattern of knocks and scraping that made the cottage windows hum. Tamash's hand went to his radio. The old woman placed one small, warm paw in the hollow of her palm and felt the impossible pull of it.
There was a history in those woods older than the names on any map, and she had been a caretaker of small things, paths, seedlings, the memorial stone for Antoni. So she knew how to keep a secret as well as anyone who had survived the years. When the first of them came through the trees, it was like a shadow that grew in stature, like a rumor that comes into a town wearing a crown. They moved with a deliberation that was not merely animal. Their stride made the forest bow in a way that spoke of ancient rites. Thick hair hung from their shoulders in curtains of moss, and their limbs were wide with muscle, the way old oaks are wide with bark. The tallest paused at the edge of the clearing and sniffed the air. An enormous head turned toward Helena's cigarette-thin form by the stove. Behind him came others, a family of silhouettes, some with babies tucked in their chests, others with scars across foreheads that told old stories of fights and of survival. At their head stood a being whose presence was the kind of legend that could silence a room. He was as tall as a door and thinner than the stories. His face, when he turned it toward her, held not rage but a difficult gathering curiosity. His eyes, coal-black and perfectly human in their depth, flicked from the pups to Helena. Yaro, she thought, a name that had been whispered to her in childhood by her grandmother when speaking of the old guardians. Yaro, the watcher at the pines. Names like that had lived in lullabies and warnings. Helena felt the sound of her own name shrink inside her like a child under a table. Pani Koilchik, she said, please. They were dying. Yaro's voice, when he used it, and he did not often, was something like wind passing through a canyon. You took them, he said. It was not an accusation of theft, but of a boundary crossed. The tribe arranged itself around the clearing like roots. One of the adults, older than the alpha, perhaps his mate, kept staring at Helena with a patience that made the hairs on her forearms stand up. The pups stirred, whimpering as the heat sifted through to their bellies. Tomas straightened, the radio crackling low in his pocket. He looked between Helena and Yaro as if he could broker a peace by placing himself in the margin. There are rules, he muttered, the professional in him surfacing like a sea wound. Interaction with unknown species, protocol, observation. His words tried to build a fence around their fragile room. Yaro inclined his head minutely toward the pups. Up close, the alpha's face wasn't the monster local legends painted. It held calluses of sorrow and an old, weary dignity. He stepped forward just far enough that Helena could see the white scar that cut from his jaw toward his throat. A scar that looked like it had been scored by steel. The sight of it made something in her chest fold. An old memory of a man with a promise made, and then broken. The alpha's fingers were enormous, but when they hovered near the pups, they trembled in a way that matched her own. You have something of ours, Yaro said, and this time there was a rumor of a plea under the words. Why did you not leave them? Helena's throat tightened. Why had she? Because Antonina's lullaby told her to honor the small, because she had watched her son's face when he had accused her, and because a life that can be saved must be saved. But those reasons did not bear well in this clearing of giants and a ranger's clipped judgments. Because I could not listen to dying, she said. It was simple, perhaps too small to be worthy of legend, yet it was the whole of her, a woman who had learned how to knit warmth into the torn places of the world, who had used her hands to make amends where ink could not. Yaro's eyes narrowed in contemplation. Around him the tribe murmured, words that were not Polish, and not any tongue she had heard in market squares, words that moved like moss over stone. There was a measuring in those murmurs, as if they were deciding whether she was friend or harvest. Tomasz watched them with a ranger's caution, his posture drawing a line between duty and empathy. The dilemma that settled over the clearing was heavier than the storm. If she handed the pups back, the forest might accept the gesture, and the tribe might leave, and the world would be as it had been, compartmentalized into rights and wrongs. If she refused, if she tried to keep them, she would bring outside eyes, scientists, conservationists, the timber company, to her door like wolves circling for what is visible. And then there was the truth pressed into the tender pulp of her chest, the old pact her family had once held with the forest, a vow her grandmother had murmured under a thatch of fevered breath. Helena had a paper somewhere, folded inside a cookbook, that might or might not be a memory of an agreement that once tethered humans to the guardians of the pines. If that paper still mattered, if the ink still bound, she had not used it as a shield when her father signed the land away. She looked at the pups as Yarrow watched, his silent judgment like an equatorial stare, and realized she was standing at the place where every kindness in her life might be counted either as redemption or as the last of her foolishness. The storm beyond the pines beat harder against the roof. A branch struck the window like a fist. Someone, or something, or time, was asking her to decide what kind of person she would be when the world watched. Helena let out a breath that tasted of steam and old ash. The pups shifted against her scarf, tiny heartbeats like misplaced beads. Yarrow's shadow leaned over the stove light as if the heat itself were an intrusive sun he had not expected to see in his world. For a long moment the clearing was a map of hung breath and held choices.
Tomasz cleared his throat and reached into his pocket for his radio, the movement nervous, professional, an appeal to something codified and neat. "I should file a report," he said. "There are procedures. If this is something, there are scientists we can call. We should document it." Yarrow's head tipped, not in mockery, but in a manner that implied an understanding older than the radio's static. "When your machines come, they take names. Names carve into the land and do not leave," he said, his vocalizations a strange, finer wood in which meaning grew slowly. Helena felt the syllables like a comb across her scalp. His words were not Polish, yet the nuance found the curves of her heart. They meant something like, "They record and do not hush." She saw in his eyes a worn patience that had withheld grief until now. Tomasz's hand stilled. "They bring headlines," he said softly, as if the word itself might be blamed. "They bring people who don't understand how to be careful. They bring cages." Helena laughed then, a short, almost surprised sound. "I'm old," she said. "They will find me a curiosity if you leave me with these. They will write me into their stories. My son," her voice cracked. The name Adam was a stone that had been in her throat for decades. She swallowed. "My son he would see nothing but the bottom line. He always did." Yarrow's coal eyes did something fragile then. They softened. For someone whose bulk could have been used to frighten storms into submission, he carried tenderness in ways that were not for spectacle. He took a step closer, careful, the ground folding around his feet like deference. "You saved life. That is not small," he said. It was not praise. It was a ledger entry, the simplest fact laid flat. The tribe shifted, restless. One of the females, her hair threaded with lichen and tiny smoked beads, stepped forward and placed her palm against the trunk of a pine. It was a gesture of anchoring, of asking the wood if it approved. Around them the air tasted like sap and expectation. The pups, sensing the multitude, squirmed and made plaintive new noises. The smaller one opened its eyes, a cloudy film receding, and blinked at Yarrow as if seeing an impossible dawn. Tomasz's radio crackled loud then, an urgent, officious intrusion. "Unit 12, we have reports of large bipedal tracks by the river. Witnesses say they saw—" His voice trailed off as he looked at the tableau before him. He had been trained to obey protocol, to call in specialists, to notify superiors. But he had also been raised in the shadow of these same pines, the stories of strange things told to him by his grandmother between winter stitches. The conflict pulled at him like tide. He was a man split into two teams, each pulling his sleeves in opposite directions. Helena stood in the middle of the cabin, an absurdly small island between the great myth and the rules of men, and felt the years she had tried to bury with neatness and tea rise like a fog.
There were reasons she had kept the old cookbook with folded papers and the pension slips. Reasons that were not legal, but moral. The ink had bled once into contracts that took acres of forest away, and the guilt had married itself to the sound of chainsaws. If she produced the faded paper hidden in flour-stained pages, she could summon a memory of an agreement, a pact that her grandmother had described as a promise between human and guardian. It might be nothing more than myth scribbled on brittle paper. It might also be the single thing that would make Yarrow trust her enough to let the pups remain under her roof, until the line between wonder and exposure could be negotiated. She reached into the heater-warmed cupboard for the cookbook. Her fingers smelled of boiled cabbage and pages, and when she cracked the spine open, the smell of flour and ink rose up, like a ghost of kitchens that had been. There, folded under a hand-drawn recipe for rye bread, was a small, thin sheet of paper browned by decades. The handwriting was a looping script she recognized as her father's, but the words were her grandmother's, a list of things to remember. Keep the boundary. Share bread. Do not let steel take the grove. If the small ones fall, bring them heat. If you are asked, answer with truth. It was not a deed, it was a covenant. The paper had no legal weight in a courthouse, but the way it was written suggested an oral law recorded for memory's sake. The margins held little crosses, and in the lower corner, a smudged fingerprint the size of a thumb. Her grandmother's, she was sure, pressed like a benediction. Jarl watched her with an expression that could have been hunger or curiosity or something more complex, hope. He stepped nearer and, breaking a custom that made Helena's heart skip, lowered himself in a way that allowed him to be closer to human height. He did not touch the paper but sniffed the air above it. The old parchment carried the scent of smoke, sewing thread, and a warmth that spoke to him in ways that words could not. He understood what it meant for a human hand to fold an agreement into a cookbook and hide it in dough-scented pages where memory and bread were cousins. "You carry words of binding," he murmured. His voice, when it came, had the gravel of a stream over stones. There was no triumph in it. There was rather a caution layered with decades of being wronged by the kind of human who traded forests for profit. Words matter, but so do actions. Helena felt the truth of that like a physical pressure on her ribs. Hands that had once signed invoices had also planted saplings in the wrong seasons, trying to fix a calamity with small, almost insolent kindnesses. She wanted to tell him everything: the sale, the fires, the night her father came home with men and papers and promises, but confession could be a weapon as well as a key.
If she owned the guilt without Yato forgiving it, she would have given him ammunition to lead his tribe away from any reconciliation. Outside, something shifted in the wind. The pines flapped like actors receiving a cue. A vehicle's distant sound, a truck, sifted through the trees. The sound was thin, a mechanical cough that meant the world beyond had heard something and was coming. Tomas's jaw tightened, and he took a step toward the doorway as if to hold the world at bay. "Stay," Yato said, not to Helena, but to the wind. It was an order more than a request. The tribe slowed, the motion of their bodies bending to his will. But the rustle of human machinery carried on, persistent and industrial as a wasp. Herds of curiosity were forming at the forest's lip, hikers with cameras, a pair of men with binoculars, someone who had already posted a shaky video and a claim that Bigfoot had been spotted. Helena's throat constricted because she understood how quickly gentleness could be devoured by spectacle. Tomas met her eyes, and for a blink of a breath the professionalism wore away, and the boy who had once tramped these woods surfaced, he who had learned to whistle for foxes and to stitch wounds with 2 large needles behind the ranger's office. "If they come in numbers," he said quietly, "they will not see you. They will want a show. They will want—" he gestured helplessly. "They will not want to leave anything unclaimed." Helena thought of the pups' small mouths, pink and shallow, of the way life had clung to them in the snow. She thought of her son, the legal man with his briefcase and his absence, who had once threatened to take her to a home for the elderly and then had walked away. She thought of the old covenant and the way her father had once pounded his fist on a table so hard the ink leaped. The decision loomed again like a winter storm: protect the living at the risk of exposure, or hand them over and let the world continue its tidy arithmetic. Yato's reply was quiet. "We do not wish war with the people who forget us," he said. "We wish only shelter for our young. You," he looked at Helena as if weighing the bread in his hand, "you have learned to keep things alive. That is rare. Perhaps you can help us decide how to keep them without being taken." The idea of being enlisted into the council of a wood-made king made Helena's knees feel like spool thread. She thought of all the nights she had thrown her body against a life that wanted to unwrap itself into nothing, and suddenly the concept of purpose, real, offered, not the thin charity of pity, settled on her like a warm shawl. But it also frightened her. To commit meant to expose. To pledge meant to risk Adam's righteous fury when he heard of it, to bring the timber company's hawks down from the valley like vultures. "How?" she whispered. "How can I protect them?" "Tell your people," Yato said simply. We will teach you to listen for the language of branches.
You will teach our young the carefulness of your fire. We will place our eyes where your machines cannot see. We will watch the lines. There was an earnest bravery in his words, a political savviness born of survival. We will make a pact. You say the truth of us, not of the way you were paid, and we will not show ourselves beyond this place. You will hide us in your stories, as if we were your mistakes redeemed. Helena opened her mouth to refuse, to bridle at the idea of secrecy, as if secrecy were another ailment. But the path of honesty had already shown its teeth. She saw, with a sudden and overwhelming clarity, the tenderness of the pup's breath held in her palm, the scab on Yarrow's jaw that matched a history she had not been allowed to erase, and she felt the small white paper in her hand, like a promise that might still be honored if she could summon the courage. Tomasz watched her, as if he were watching a stage actor deciding to stay in a scene. His face had the color of someone who had been given permission to feel for the first time in a long while. If we do this, he said, we need rules, we need watch rotations, we need to keep the road clear of reporters. I can try to keep people away. I can do that. You will need to keep away your curiosity, Yarrow murmured, almost gently. Curiosity kills the small warmth. Helena laughed then, a sound that was more like a vow. Then we'll be thieves of warmth, she said. We'll be thieves together. The sound of the truck grew, closer, and with it the example of a world that did not like its mysteries guarded. But inside Helena's chest, something was coming awake that had not been awake in 20 years, the modest, stubborn pleasure of being needed. She slid the folded covenant into her apron, where it would keep to the heat of her body and the rhythm of her hands. She could already hear her son's voice in her head, furious and legal and final. She could already imagine the timber company's lawyers with their crisp collars. But the two pups warmed themselves against a mittened thumb and made a sound like the beginning of a story. And for tonight that pleading noise was its own kind of law. So we hide, Helena said. Her voice was small and fierce. We teach your young the quiet. We teach ours the old ways. We keep them here until the winter turns. But if anyone comes, if anyone tries to take them, I'll stand in the doorway. Yarrow's face, massive and furred, tilted in a way that might have been a smile. He reached forward, hesitated, and then allowed his enormous hand to hover above the pups, not touching but blessing. Then we will stand behind you, he said. We will be the shadow of the trees. We will be the silence. They were an absurd alliance on paper. A frail woman with flour on her hands, a ranger split in two, and a tribe of mythic guardians willing to teach human ears how to listen. But in the small, combustible kitchen, where two tiny lives warmed and a covenant folded into someone's apron, the outline of a different future began to be traced, difficult, dangerous, and tender as the first stitch of a mending. Outside, the truck slowed as headlights bored through the trees. Inside, Helena knelt and pressed the smallest pup to her cheek, a gesture of claiming that was less possession than oath. She felt Yarrow's eyes on her, and in that look, a question. What is the cost of mercy? She did not yet know the full ledger. But as the wind whined and the first distant voices of the outsiders reached like flutes, she made a choice small enough to be human and large enough to be a legend. She would keep them tonight. She would face tomorrow on whatever terms it demanded. And somewhere beneath the pines, things older than law shifted their weight, as if preparing to watch a strange and necessary reconciliation unfold. The reporter's flashlight cut through the pines like the blunt end of a question. Voices multiplied outside, curiosity becoming a choir, and the truck's engine hummed like a restless animal. Helena heard the scrape of boot soles, and then her son's voice, the particular metallic timbre of Adam when he was furious and practiced at being right. He had the legal cadence now, a rhythm she had heard on the phone for years, sentences shaped into weapons. "Mother," he barked as he stepped into the kitchen, eyes immediately seeking the stove, the pups, the faces, her face soft with flour and heat. The sight of him should have been a small forgiveness. Instead, it landed like a ledger dropped on a table. He was followed not only by a lawyer in a dark coat, but by a woman with a camera, and a man carrying a portable recorder. They treated the small cottage like a stage, and Helena like an actress who had forgotten her lines. "You did what?" Adam said. He set his hands on his hips the way he had when he disciplined her as a child, as if she were both incompetent and sentimental, a dangerous combination. "You let animals into the house? You could have died. You could have gotten bitten. Do you have any—" "They're not dangerous," Helena said. The pups squirmed against her apron, their warmth a pleading press. "They were dying. I could not watch them die." Adam's jaw tightened until the knuckles blanched. "You could have called me," he said. "You had me leave, tell me where you were going when you left that night with the deed. You left me to fight the legal cluster that followed. And now—" He gestured at the truck idling, the bystanders, the man with a microphone making a face like a vulture-smelling headline. "Now you're theatrical. You know what this will do, Mother. Scientists, reporters, the timber company's eyes. This will become a circus. They'll take the pups and they'll take anything else that's left." Helena's fingers tightened around the thin, warm body between them. The small heart vibrated against her palm. She could feel it like a fragile drum. "They will not get them," she whispered. "Not if I can help it." Adam's face changed. The copper of anger cooled to something else. Fear for his own world where deeds and contracts were the bones. "This is not about you being sentimental," he said. "This is about liability, about precedent. Do you understand what an animal like this, if it is what everyone thinks, would bring? Scientists will petition for custody for study. The government will step in. You will be declared unfit to care for anything and—" He reached toward the pups as though to take them, a gesture both tender and invasive, and Helena recoiled, the flinch red as a betrayal in his eyes. "You sold the land," she said suddenly, the words bitter and precise. "My father signed. I did not. I could not stop it. I have lived under that for 20 years, Adam. I have done nothing to unmake what they did, except to keep small things alive. Do you still think I'm the one at fault?" Adam's mouth moved without forming explanation. He had the law at his fingertips, and the law had a way of flattering men into righteousness. The lawyer behind him made the emergency legal contingency motions he was paid to make, outlining property rights and state interest as if those were shields to be held up. The conversation had the terrible crispness of paper cutting skin. Outside, someone shouted. The camera light flared a ray across the clearing where the tribe watched. Yarrow stepped closer to the tree line, his shoulders hunched in the wind like a man taking in a gust. He had kept his composure for the sake of the pups and the pact. Now, with bright machines slicing the dark and Adam's voice sharp as a file, the alpha's restraint thinned like ice after spring. "Your son brings the knife of law," Yarrow said to Helena, not with accusation exactly, but with the kind of sorrow that sits heavy on shoulders. The tribe murmured. A female with a scarred forehead tapped a rhythm on a tree trunk that Hannah could not parse, but felt as a warning pulse. Tamash stood behind Adam, his ranger's hat crooked, his face the color of someone caught between song and silence. He had been arguing for a way to keep the situation calm, to document and protect without spectacle, but the world had a habit of answering with a louder instrument than care. In a moment of professional panic, an attempt to put the event into a protocol so the chaos could be contained, he had radioed for backup earlier, calling in units for safety to secure the area. Those words would blossom into more men at the gate, more lights, more invasive hands. He had not meant it. He had meant to call for protection. Now he watched his choice sprout consequences like burrs. "Stand down," a voice outside cried. This is sensational! A Bigfoot sighting in Kowalczyk's cottage!" The camera lady's words were triumphant.
Someone had already posted a shaky clip, 2 old hands, a stove, the flash of coal-black eyes at the kitchen window. The internet would not be courteous. It would be hungry. One of Yarrow's younger males, someone who had been watching Helena with a suspicion that matched the thrift of winter, stepped forward, his voice more like a cough than a sentence. "They will take our young in cages," he said, in the language that threaded through the tribe like a map. "They will show them like trophies. We come for our blood." His eyes, which had never known human youth, found Helena and hardened into something like accusation. "We come for what you took." Helena's knuckles went white as she clasped the pup. The accusation was a blade and a balm in one, a blade because it named what she feared most, being an instrument of separation,
and a balm because it was closer to honesty than anything she had had in years. "I did not take them to harm," she said. "I took them because I could not leave them to snow." "You keep secrets," another female from the tribe hissed. "You kept the paper in bread, and you hid your kind." The language, surprising, almost a dialect of something ancient, made herself sound like a traitor. Around the clearing, opinions were a tide, past wrongs surfacing in the form of present fear. Then Helena did something her heart had prepared for. She sang. The lullaby rose from her like steam from a kettle, the old syllables of a tongue that had become private in her family, a tongue neither wholly human nor wholly the tribe's. "Mora, mora, stresh," she hummed, and the words, when they met Yarrow's ears, made him stagger as if a particular gust had pressed upon his chest. He tilted his head. The coal blackness of his gaze softened and deepened, catching on a memory that had the smell of smoke and bread. Yarrow's breath hitched. The lines of his face drew together and then relaxed. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when they opened, there was something like recognition knitting the fur along his brow. It was a small, dangerous miracle. The language that had lived in Helena's head was part of the tribe's old song. "You speak our old words," Yarrow said, not accusing now but amazed. His voice vibrated in the clearing like an answered bell. "These are the words my grandmother used before the smoke came." "How?" Helena sucked in a breath that tasted of peat and regret. The confession rose in her like a tide. Her grandmother had told stories of crossing boundaries, of a night when a guardian had saved a child, and a promise had been threaded into the family's recipes. Helena had paid attention as a child, had kept the scripts and told herself they were only stories. Now they were a lifeline. "My grandmother," she began, and the story she had folded into flour and stitched into cookies tumbled out in pieces, of a handshake beneath a birch, of bread offered at an offering, of a small thumbprint on a parchment to remember a promise.
She spoke of the covenant she'd found in the cookbook and how it had always been a rule and a prayer, not a deed one could take to a courtroom. She spoke of her father's selling and of the way he had wronged the woods. The tribe listened as if each word was a kindling. Some faces softened, others, older and steeled, tightened as if recalling an old scar. Yarrow's eyes strayed to Adam, and in that glance was an archaic calculation that had nothing to do with deeds and everything to do with lineage. "You are tied to us," he said slowly. "Not by law, perhaps, not by paper legible to men, but by blood and memory." Adam staggered as if struck. "What are you saying?" he demanded. What claim could you possibly have?" "You sold what you did not wholly own," Yarrow replied. "There are agreements older than ink. Your family forgot to keep all of them. Some of you carry the old sound in your mouths and do not know it. She carried it until she wore it thin. The word blood landed then, heavy and blinking. For the tribe it meant a kind of betrayal and a promise at once. For Adam it meant a scandal he could not legislate away. He looked at his mother with a mix of disbelief and a dawning horror. "You never told me," he said at last, the accusation unspooling into something like grief. "You never told me you were part of—" "I did not know to tell you what I did not entirely know myself," Helena said. Her voice was a threadbare garment, frayed at the edges but warm. "My grandmother told stories. I kept them like a secret recipe. I thought I was protecting you from superstition. I thought I was protecting myself." Tomash's eyes were wet. He had been carrying a list of professional duties in his head and found that the list dissolved when faced with the living, breathing disorder of truth. For the first time he felt that the forest's politics were not something he could paper over. He wanted to reach forward and make amends by offering his hand to Helena and to Yarrow. He wanted to promise that his radio call, meant for protection, would not be the instrument of their undoing. But his earlier crack of compliance had already emitted a sound into the machinery of men. And then the pups gave a small, frightened whine. The stress, the headlights, the voices, the revelation of lineage, tightened like a corset around their tiny chests. One pup's breathing became labored. The smaller pup's nostrils fluttered with a rattled urgency. Helena's hands trembled as she tried to steady it, and in that small, panicked act, she made an error of human pride.
She called for help and not for secrecy, for a veterinarian if anyone knew one. The radio in Tomasz's pocket crackled, a minor betrayal. The recorded voice carried outside like a bell. Someone at the road clicked their phone, and the feed flickered back to the world. The tribe stiffened into motion, their bodies a literal wall of fur and muscle.
"They are hurt because your world bleeds into ours," the scarred female said, in a voice that hardly masked its fury. "You call for help by bringing men like that." Her gaze pierced Helena. "You have mixed the waters." Yarrow barked a sound that was not quite a human word and not an animal's. He took a step between the intruders and the pups, and for a heart's beat, Helena saw the alpha's rage, an ancient, protective thing, burn up like a struck match. But alongside it was the echo of her lullaby in his ears, a memory of a benediction that softened the blow. He did not attack. He could, and that possibility was a blade that quivered above all of them. Adam, wounded and proud, reached for legal remedy like someone reaching for armor. "Mother, you cannot—" His words cut. "You cannot hide things like this. If you were middle-aged, perhaps people would take your story for eccentricity. But you are 60, 80. I'm not going to let you make this our family's ruin." He turned toward the reporter as if to make his position plain. "This is property and conservation law. We will appeal to the authorities for a formal assessment." The lawyer nodded approvingly, the sound like ice against glass. Tomasz's face crumpled suddenly, the agony of a man who had loved this place enough to want to defend it, but who now saw his single protective act splinter into 1,000 currents. He had called for backup, hoping to create shelter. Instead, he had summoned spectacle. He swallowed, and, with a steadiness that might have been despair, tried to reach Helena. "We can move them," he said quietly. "We can move the pups somewhere safe. Keep them warm. Keep them out of sight. Please." Helena looked at him, at Adam, at Yarrow. The revelation of her blood had shredded a veil into ribbons. Where she had hoped the craft a slow bridge between human order and forest law, she now saw jagged edges. Some of the tribe's faces flamed with the kind of distrust that would not be soothed by words. Some eyes softened with the acceptance that promises, once discovered, need tending. Adam's departure would be inevitable. The timber company would hear, and their machinery was as patient and as indifferent as hunger. Tomasz's earlier radio call had already pushed more people to the edge of the clearing like sharks scenting blood. "I am sorry," Helena said in the low voice of absolution. The pups' tiny chests rose and fell in the hollow of her hands. One of them, the smaller with the clouded eye, shuddered. Helena felt the fracture in her chest widened, and spoke more to herself than to the crowd. "I am so sorry." The tribe began to retreat, not in surrender, but in a silent reorganization that would allow them to vanish if need be. Yarrow's massive frame blended into the pines, but he did not leave entirely. He stood at the line where trees became clearing, like a sentinel, with a heart in question. Helena watched his profile cut the dim light, and in the movement she felt both the comfort of a promise kept and the dread of a bond that had been broken into pieces by confession and the weak human need to name everything. As the reporters took pictures and the truck's engine idled impatiently, as Adam paced and Tomasz closed his eyes for a single honest minute, Helena knelt beside the pups and felt the cold of the room like a summons. Secrets had been opened, and the soft tissue of trust lay exposed, raw as a wound. Some would heal, some might never knit back the same. The fracture lines had been drawn not only between species, but within a small human family, and in the heart of a man who had once vowed to protect the woods. Outside, the world took notice. Inside, Helena cupped the smaller pup and felt its breath stutter like a question. The choices she'd made, of mercy, of secrecy, of love, had led them to a place where every action had consequence. The revelation of her lineage had bought the tribe some truth, but had torn her relationship with her son and with the human world. Trust had been cracked like glass. The shards glittered with the promise of light and danger both. Tomasz reached for Helena's hand, and then stopped, as if the warmth might burn him. Yarrow's shadow lingered at the tree line like a waiting thing. Adam turned away, his shoulders stiff like someone preparing to battle an old enemy. The pups slept fitfully, and the night outside was thick with the sound of strangers assembling for a show that had begun without permission. For the first time in decades, Helena felt very small and very exposed. The covenant in her apron rustled against her thigh like a bird hoping to fly. She had opened a door she could not close. She had called the forest back to her hearth, and now watched as the return of ancient things made the people she loved fracture and rearrange like sticks in a winter fire. The cost of mercy, she now understood, would demand other currencies: public confession, legal battle, perhaps even exile. And yet, as she pressed the tiny, ragged body to her chest and hummed the old lullaby again, she could not find regret enough to unmake the warmth. The fracture was real. The work of mending it had only begun. The reporter's flashlight stuttered like nervous lightning. Adam's voice rose again, legal strings taut and ready to strum. The lawyer murmured about custody and state interest as if he were closing a brief. But before the words could become ordinance, Yarrow moved. He did not charge or thunder. He stepped from the tree line with deliberate, measured grace that made the cameras strain to make shapes of him. He left the safety of shadow with something like a purpose in his shoulders, and the clearing inhaled at the sight. A giant walking into the small, foolish world that had wronged his people for profit.
He had decided, in the weary arithmetic of his heart, that some debts could not be collected with claws, and that some transactions required sacrifice. "Stop," Yarrow said, and his voice fell into the air like a canyon dropping its pebble. The sound did not demand, it announced. Everyone froze. The men with microphones, the lawyer with his notes, even Adam, who had been trained to turn arguments into order. Yarrow looked at Helena then, his coal eyes catching the stovelight like twin embers. In that look there was no pretense of spectacle, only a raw building of courage. He stepped closer to her, each movement uncanny in its quiet. "I will speak," he said, addressing the humans in the blunt, almost ceremonial cadence of someone about to break a pattern. "I will own what is ours and what has been taken from us by your machines and your contracts. I will take responsibility in a way your courts will see." The words were not perfect in any human language, but the translator of the clearing, the old melody that hummed in Helena's bones, made their meaning clear. Helena's hand tightened on the pup. Her first thought was that he would be punished by his people, that claiming them would mean exile, or worse, the slow, communal judgment that had kept Yarrow's tribe shy of human eyes for centuries. Her second thought, sharper and intimate, was that he had just crossed an impossible boundary for her. He had given up the shelter of anonymity for her, for 2 fragile lives, for the hope that mercy might be repaid with something other than fear. "What are you doing?" Adam demanded, stunned into a kind of legal impotency. "You can't." "I can," Yarrow replied simply. "I will be here to explain, to negotiate. I will step into your legal light if you promise to stop the machines and to speak truth about us without profit." His voice was iron wrapped in lichen. "I accept that there will be those in my tribe who will not forgive me. I accept that." He lifted his head as if weighing exile like a possible winter. "But I will not see my young caged." The lawyer's face went the color of paper left too long in the sun. Reporters shouted questions, sensational, incredulous, but the core of the scene had shifted. It was no longer a curiosity to be filed and sold. It was now a negotiation of life and dignity, and in that reframing the instruments of commerce seemed suddenly inadequate. Helena found her voice then. The old lullaby's cadence knotted through it like seamster's thread. "If you will stand," she said to the cluster of people, to the men with notepads and the county official she could see at the edge of the gathering, "then listen to us. There is a history here that ink cannot measure. My family, my father, signed papers that took more than trees. I kept a promise my grandmother made, to shelter what your laws would not see. I take responsibility for this choice. I ask for a chance to make amends, legally, publicly, and with care." Her confession landed like an anchor. There was no tendering of excuses, only a brittle, brave ownership. Adam staggered as if struck. His hands, which had always found comfort in the straightness of contracts, trembled. The lawyer found his mouth opening and closing like a fish, legalese failing to breathe in the human-shaped air now thick with history. Tomasz stepped forward, dropping his ranger's mask to show the skinny, vulnerable eagerness beneath. "I will coordinate," he said. "I will keep the road clear of opportunists. I will organize a controlled assessment with independent conservationists who respect consent. We will not allow cages. We will not allow exhibition."
If Yarrow will speak with certified mediators and Helena will sign an affidavit of responsibility and of the covenant, then we can form a defensive legal umbrella. We can ask for emergency protection. There was fear in Tomasz's offer, fear of the timber company ratcheting up its appetite, but also a kind of practical bravery that came from loving a place enough to fight for it properly. The county official at the edge of the crowd, a woman who had seen more than her share of courthouse theatrics, studied Yarrow's face and then Helena's. Her pen hovered for a breath, then moved. "We'll convene a panel," she said finally, "but this must be done with consent and with transparency. No cages, no shows. We will consider environmental protective status." Yarrow's shoulders lowered like an old door easing closed. He had offered himself to the world's machinery, risking exile by his people, for the small breathing lives in the kitchen, and for the woman who had sheltered them. It was a sacrifice that reeked of nobility, a leader willing to be seen so his young might be safe. Helena's chest cracked open at the sight. Something tender and foolish rose in her like sap in spring. She stepped forward, moving beyond fear and the spinning of old guilt into something more dangerous, joy. She took Yarrow's massive hand, palm to palm, feeling the roughness of bark and a tremor that matched her own. For a second the world narrowed to the warmth of two hands, one furred and enormous, the other knotted and small. Cameras flashed, but the moment was not for them. It was for two beings who had reached across the ruin of age and law to hold a fragile, shared future. "I will stand with you," she said, not as a plea but as a promise. "If they will let him speak, and if they will not turn our children into curios, I will go before them. I will tell the story of what my family did and what I will try to fix. I will be the one they come for, if they must. That is my payment." Yarrow's coal eyes stung with something that could have been tears. He did not bow. He offered instead a tilt of his massive head that was close enough. "Then we bind," he said. "We will teach your people the language of trees. You will teach ours how to trust the cook fire of folk who mean them no harm. We will be careful. We will be honest."
Adam watched, the boy who had once been a son, seeing his mother stand, not for his laws, but for something larger. And for the first time, the rigid lines he had drawn between right and wrong unfurled a little. The lawyer's jaw tightened. Still, his pen slowed. The camera's word, hungry, but the narrative had shifted. It was no longer exploitation, but negotiation for care. When the small rattled pup breathed and settled, a tiny acceptance hummed through Helena's hands. The two of them, an old woman and an ancient guardian, had traded safety for exposure, hand for hand. It was not a happy ending yet. There were legal storms on the horizon, angry shareholders like wolves, and a tribe that would need placations of trust. But in the kitchen's hot iron light, with the hush of the pines pressing in and the headlights pooling like indifferent moons, they had done what love often requires. They had stepped into danger, not for glory, but for the quiet work of saving one another. Outside, hunters of headlines murmured, and then, reluctantly, began to take notes that would be less sharp. Tomasz organized a human cordon, and the county official made arrangements, a controlled assessment, a legal motion for immediate protective status, and an agreement that there would be no commercialization. Yarrow would speak, and Helena would tell the truth. The cost would be high, perhaps exile from certain comforts, perhaps the scorn of those who could not understand mercy, but it was a cost they chose. When the dusk drew its curtain, the clearing had the tired beauty of a battle that had ended without blood. Helena sat with the pups cradled against her chest. Yarrow lingered in the doorway like a slow, friendly storm, his bulk a promise more than a threat. He reached down and set, with care that had the tenderness of a lover's touch, a large, furred hand over Helena's, covering her fingers as if to say, "I will be your witness, I will be your reckoning, I will be the shadow you need." She pressed her forehead against that massive palm and let herself weep for the father who had signed away groves, and for the son who had left, and for the life she'd been given now, messy, dangerous, and utterly alive. The sacrifice had not been for show. It was a private, courageous choosing. In that small, fierce closeness, woman and guardian, past and future braided, Helena felt redemption fold into the fabric of the night. The pines listened, and somewhere approved. Days later, the pines kept their counsel. The county's temporary protection petition held long enough for a slow, awkward truce to be stitched into place. No cameras, no cages, controlled scientific oversight with a clause written in plain, stubborn language, respect consent. Adam, humbler than Helena had seen him in years, signed the affidavit she insisted upon and sat across from her at the kitchen table, his hands folded like a man learning how to be small again. He did not praise her. He could not. Instead, he brought firewood and mended a window she had left patched for months. It was enough.
Tomasz became the quiet axis the small community turned around. He organized night watches, rotating with 2 young men from the tribe who had been taught, in turns, how to boil broth without singeing the whiskers of the pups. He ferried supplies and kept the reporters at the legal perimeter while learning to listen to the pines the way Yarrow taught him, waiting for a hollow note that meant rain, a creak that meant a nesting pair. His radio, once a blunt instrument, became a promise, protection, not possession. The pups grew in the safety of that liminal life, neither exhibition nor wholly hidden. They learned the warmth of a human lap and the hush of a forest sermon. Their fur filled out, their eyes cleared, and they practiced clumsy strides that made Helena clap like a child. Her kitchen smelled of baking and sap. Mornings were a tidy liturgy of bottle feeds and careful teaching. Yarrow watched from the clearing, sometimes at the door, sometimes at the distant ridge where his tribe kept vigil. He came closer each day, not to claim, but to learn the small economies of human closeness, how Helena folded a quilt, how she hummed a lullaby that soothed both beast and person. Their romance was not thunderous. It grew in quiet concessions, a huge hand left at her doorway, a pot of stew shared on an extra plate, and a slow learning of each other's languages, his in the grammar of footprints and sap, hers in the crooked grammar of recipes and law. Yarrow learned to listen to the ache behind Helena's silences. She learned to read the subtle weight of his gaze, the way it softened when she watched her plant seedlings along the ridge where the fires had tried to take root. In the mornings they would sit with a thermos of tea between them, her small cup in his huge palm like a held planet, and speak in broken sentences, stitched together with laughter. Theirs was a companionship of rescue, an old woman finding a guardian who would hold her publicly, and a leader finding a human who would keep his secret with the stubborn tenderness of kin. The tribe, wary at first, accepted the new covenant in its own time. There were rituals, gifts of carved wood, a shared night of story and bread, a promise sealed with a smear of berry juice across palms. Some elders still crossed the clearing in the dark, unseen. Some youths came nearer, curious and braver than their forebears. The timber company's petitions sputtered against the county's fastened protection and the fierce public chorus Helena and Tomasz had rallied for, conservationists, local elders, and even a surprised journalist who, after coming to the clearing hungry for spectacle, left with a piece that read like a love letter to keeping secrets. When spring finally stroked the pines with new green, the pups, now gangly, ridiculous adolescents, took their first cautious steps beyond the clearing, tails high with triumph. They returned each dusk to the stovelight that had saved them, and to the woman who had chosen to be small and brave. Yarrow stood at the tree line one evening as Helena bent to tuck a blanket, the last light catching the steam above her breath. He stepped forward and, in a motion that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with belonging, pressed his forehead to hers. It was not a claim, but a greeting, an anchor between 2 lives that had been unmoored. Helena smiled into his furred brow, the laugh like a coin dropped into a well of years. Around them the pines kept their watch. Beyond the ridge, the world hummed with its indifferent appetite. But in that kitchen, patched and warm, an 80-year-old widow and an ancient guardian had made an arrangement that would outlast press cycles and contract clauses, to keep, to teach, and to bear witness. The small covenant they made, sealed in bread, tape, and a smudged fingerprint in a cookery notebook, became the quiet law of a new normal. On nights when the snow still whispered, Helena would hum the old lullaby, and Yarrow would answer in low, resonant notes that set the pines to listening. Their voices braided into the dark like 2 old promises keeping each other safe. In the end, it was not triumph that lasted, but the slow, stubborn work of care. And that, more than any headline, became the story the forest remembered.